April 18, 1945. The Ruhr Valley, Germany. 300,000 German soldiers, an entire army group, made a decision that would reshape the final weeks of World War II. They didn't flee. They didn't fight to the last man as Hitler had ordered. Instead, they chose to surrender en masse to American forces rather than face the alternative. This wasn't cowardice. This was survival. Because what awaited these men if they fell into Soviet hands was far worse than any honorable capitulation to the Western Allies. The story of Army Group B's surrender remains one of the most extraordinary mass capitulations in military history. A tale of pragmatic commanders, exhausted soldiers, and a choice between certain death and uncertain mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The seeds of this unprecedented surrender were planted months earlier, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes during winter 1944. Field Marshal Walter Model, a compact, intense man of 54 years with piercing eyes and an iron reputation, commanded Army Group B through Germany's last desperate offensive in the West. Model was known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Führer's fireman, the general who was called upon whenever a crisis erupted on the eastern or western fronts. He had earned this nickname through years of aggressive defensive tactics, masterful retreats that preserved fighting forces, and an unwavering loyalty to Hitler that bordered on fanaticism. Born in Genthin, Brandenburg, on January 24, 1891, Model had served in the Imperial German Army during World War I, earning the Iron Cross First Class for bravery. Between the wars, he had been an instructor at the War Academy and a staff officer, building a reputation for meticulous planning and innovative tactics. When World War II erupted, Model rose rapidly through the ranks, commanding panzer divisions in France, then entire armies on the Eastern Front. By 1944, he had become one of Hitler's most trusted field commanders, a man who could be counted on to execute impossible orders and somehow achieve results. But the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's grandiose attempt to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp, had failed catastrophically. Model had known from the beginning that the offensive was doomed. The Wehrmacht lacked the fuel, the air support, and the manpower reserves necessary for such an ambitious operation. Yet Model had obeyed his orders, throwing his armies against the American lines in a desperate gamble that consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. When the offensive stalled in early January 1945, Model's forces retreated eastward, pursued by vengeful American divisions eager to punish the Germans for the surprise attack. Model understood military mathematics better than the madman in Berlin. His 325,000 soldiers were already exhausted from months of continuous combat and retreat. They were short on ammunition, critically low on fuel, and completely devoid of air cover. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, while American fighter bombers roamed the skies freely, strafing anything that moved. His men were hungry, supply lines had been severed by the encirclement, and the Ruhr's stockpiles, while substantial, were finite. Most critically, his soldiers knew the war was lost. Model could see it in their eyes when he visited forward positions. These were veterans who had fought from Stalingrad to Normandy, from the gates of Moscow to the forests of Belgium. They had watched the Reich shrink month by month, kilometer by kilometer. They had seen their cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Many had received letters from home describing the horror of Soviet occupation in the East. They knew that Germany's defeat was not a matter of if, but when. And they knew that every day they continued fighting was another day they might die for a cause that was already lost. The soldiers of Army Group B were not cowards. They were professionals who had done their duty under impossible circumstances. But by April 1945, duty had become a question with no clear answer. Did duty mean obeying Hitler's suicidal orders and dying for nothing? Or did duty mean preserving their lives so they might return home to rebuild what remained of Germany after the inevitable defeat? Model wrestled with this question throughout the first week of April, even as American forces tightened the noose around the Ruhr pocket. The American strategy for reducing the pocket was methodical and overwhelming. General Omar Bradley assigned the mission primarily to Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army and elements of Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army. Rather than launching costly frontal assaults against fortified positions, the Americans applied constant pressure from all directions, slicing the pocket into smaller segments and systematically isolating German units from each other and from their command structure. American artillery pounded German positions around the clock. Fighter bombers struck any concentration of troops or vehicles. Psychological warfare teams broadcasted surrender appeals in German, promising fair treatment and warm meals to any soldiers who laid down their arms. The German soldiers listened to these broadcasts on whatever radio still functioned. The Americans promised that prisoners of war would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They would be fed, housed in camps, and eventually repatriated after the war ended. The broadcasts emphasized that the Western Allies were not barbarians. German soldiers who surrendered to Americans or British forces would not be tortured, starved, or worked to death. The contrast with what awaited those captured by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front could not have been more stark. Every German soldier in the Ruhr pocket had heard the stories from the East. Letters from comrades fighting the Red Army painted a nightmarish picture of Soviet treatment of prisoners. The Soviets, understandably enraged by 4 years of brutal German occupation that had killed 20 million Soviet citizens, showed little mercy to captured Wehrmacht soldiers. Prisoners were often shot out of hand. Those who survived capture faced forced labor in Siberian gulags, starvation rations, and conditions that killed prisoners by the thousands. The survival rate for German prisoners in Soviet hands was estimated at less than 30%. To surrender to the Russians was, in many cases, simply a slower form of execution. Model knew all of this.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His officers knew it. His soldiers certainly knew it. And this knowledge shaped every decision made in those desperate April days. The unspoken understanding within Army Group B was that if surrender became necessary, it must be to the Americans, not the Soviets. Better to become a prisoner of the Western Allies and survive the war than to die defending ruins in obedience to a madman's orders, or fall into Soviet captivity and perish slowly in some frozen camp beyond the Urals. On April 8, 1945, American forces launched a major offensive to split the Ruhr pocket in half. The 8th Infantry Division, supported by armor and overwhelming air power, drove eastward through the center of the pocket, reaching the Ruhr River and effectively severing Model's command into 2 isolated segments. Communication between units became increasingly difficult as radio equipment failed or was destroyed by American artillery. Model's headquarters staff struggled to maintain any semblance of command and control over forces that were rapidly disintegrating. In the northern portion of the pocket, entire divisions began surrendering without orders from higher command. On April 10th, the 89th Infantry Division, encircled near Dortmund and completely out of ammunition, sent envoys under white flags to negotiate surrender terms with the American 95th Infantry Division. The surrender was formalized on April 11th, with 11,000 German soldiers marching into captivity. They were disarmed, searched, given food and water, and transported to hastily erected prisoner-of-war cages in the rear areas. Word of their treatment spread rapidly through the remaining German forces in the pocket. Model watched his army dissolve around him. Junior officers were surrendering their companies and battalions without consulting their superiors. Entire regiments simply stopped fighting and waited for American forces to overrun their positions. On April 14th, Model's Chief of Staff, General Karl Wagener, approached him with a proposal. Wagener was a thoughtful, pragmatic officer who had served with Model for 2 years. He respected his commander but could no longer remain silent about the futility of continued resistance. Wagener laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Army Group B had perhaps a week's worth of ammunition remaining at current expenditure rates. Food supplies would last perhaps 2 weeks if rigorously rationed. Fuel for vehicles was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were critically short, and the wounded could not be evacuated or properly treated. Most significantly, German soldiers were deserting or surrendering at an accelerating rate. Within days, perhaps a week at most, organized resistance would collapse entirely, regardless of orders from Model or Berlin. Wagner proposed that Model take the initiative and negotiate a formal surrender of Army Group B to American forces. By surrendering the entire Army Group as a unit, Model could ensure orderly capitulation and humane treatment for his men. He could prevent the chaos and bloodshed that would result from piecemeal collapse. Most importantly, he could save the lives of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who would otherwise die pointlessly in the pocket's final spasm or fall into Soviet hands if they attempted to break out eastward. Model listened in silence. When Wagner finished, the field marshal stood and walked to the window of his office, staring out at the devastated German landscape. The Ruhr Valley, once the industrial heart of the Reich, lay in ruins. Factories stood as burned-out shells. Cities were moonscapes of rubble. The roads were clogged with columns of refugees fleeing westward, away from the advancing Soviets, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. After several minutes, Model turned back to Wagner. His response was quiet but firm. He could not surrender Army Group B.
His oath as a German officer and his loyalty to the Führer forbade such an action. To surrender while he still commanded functioning military units would be treason. It would dishonor everything he had fought for throughout his military career. Hitler had placed trust in him, and Model could not betray that trust, no matter how insane the Führer's orders had become. But Model also could not continue ordering his men to die for nothing. He had seen too much death, wasted too many lives in futile obedience to Berlin's increasingly deranged commands. He was trapped between conflicting duties, between his oath to Hitler and his responsibility to the men under his command. The contradiction was tearing him apart. Model made a decision that was both a compromise and a capitulation. He would not order the surrender of Army Group B, but he would also not order his troops to fight to the death. Instead, he would dissolve the command structure. He would release his soldiers from their oaths of obedience and allow individual commanders to make their own decisions about surrender. It was a legal fiction, a way for Model to avoid personally ordering capitulation while ensuring that his men could surrender without being branded as traitors or deserters. On April 15, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model issued his final order to Army Group B. The order, transmitted by radio and courier to all remaining units, was brief and unprecedented. Model announced that effective immediately, Army Group B was dissolved as a military formation. All subordinate units were released from Central Command. Officers and soldiers were free to attempt breakout toward German lines in the east or to surrender to American forces as they saw fit. Model would remain at his headquarters, but would no longer issue orders or attempt to coordinate military operations. The war for Army Group B was effectively over. The dissolution order shocked Model's staff. Some officers, the old guard who still believed in the Nazi cause, condemned it as treachery. Others, the pragmatists, who understood that Germany's defeat was inevitable, saw it as an act of mercy. Model himself seemed strangely at peace after issuing the order, as though a tremendous burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He gathered his personal staff and told them that they were free to leave, to surrender, or to remain with him as they chose. Most chose to leave, accepting Model's release from duty and making their way toward American lines. Throughout April 16th and 17th, German units across the Ruhr pocket began surrendering in massive numbers. The 116th Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, remnants of the 9th Panzer Division, infantry divisions, artillery battalions, support units all laid down their arms. American forces, initially surprised by the scale of the capitulation, scrambled to process the flood of prisoners. Temporary camps were established in open fields, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by military police. German soldiers were searched, registered, given identification tags marking them as prisoners of war,
fed from American field kitchens, and housed in tents or under open sky until more permanent facilities could be arranged. The treatment of these prisoners became a subject of significant historical debate. American forces, stretched thin by rapid advances on multiple fronts, struggled to provide adequate food, shelter, and sanitation for hundreds of unexpected captives. Conditions in the improvised camps were harsh, particularly in the early days. Prisoners slept in muddy fields, exposed to rain and cold. Food was often insufficient, with prisoners receiving reduced rations compared to American soldiers. Medical care was limited. These conditions, while far better than what awaited prisoners in Soviet hands, were still difficult. Despite the hardships, the German soldiers who surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr Pocket survived the war.
They were eventually transferred to more permanent camps, processed through intelligence screening to identify war criminals and Nazi Party officials, and ultimately repatriated to Germany after the war's end. The survival rate for Germans captured by Americans was estimated at over 95%, a stark contrast to the horrific mortality rates in Soviet captivity. Field Marshal Walter Model did not surrender. On April 17, 1945, he left his headquarters with only his aide-de-camp, driving through the disintegrating German lines toward a forest near the town of Duisburg. Model had decided that he could not surrender and could not be captured. His entire identity was bound up in his military honor and his loyalty to Germany. To become a prisoner would be an unbearable humiliation. To face trial as a war criminal, likely to be charged for his role in various operations on the Eastern Front, was unthinkable. In a clearing in the woods, with his aide standing nearby, Field Marshal Walter Model removed his service pistol and shot himself. He was 54 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave by his aide, who then surrendered to American forces shortly thereafter. Model's death was not made public immediately. American intelligence officers, interrogating captured German officers, gradually pieced together what had happened. Model's body was not discovered until after the war, exhumed and identified through dental records and uniform remnants. Model's suicide remains controversial. Some historians view it as an act of honor, a commander taking responsibility for his failures and refusing to be captured by the enemy. Others see it as a final act of fanaticism, the product of a militaristic culture that valued death over pragmatic survival. Model himself left no note, no explanation for his decision. He simply chose death over surrender, perhaps believing that this was the only way to preserve whatever remained of his honor. By April 18, 1945, the organized resistance in the Ruhr Pocket had completely collapsed. American forces rounded up the final holdouts, isolated groups of soldiers who had not received Model's dissolution order or who were too far from American lines to surrender easily. The count of prisoners exceeded all expectations. When the final tallies were compiled, American forces had captured approximately 325,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr Pocket operation. It was the largest mass surrender of German forces to Western allies during World War II, comparable in scale only to the surrender of Army Group Africa in Tunisia in 1943. The logistical challenge of processing, housing, and feeding 325,000 prisoners was enormous. The American military government in occupied Germany had to rapidly expand prisoner of war camp capacity, requisition additional supplies, and organize transportation for prisoners to camps throughout Germany and eventually to facilities in France and even the United States. The sudden influx of prisoners strained resources, but also provided a massive labor pool that was eventually employed in reconstruction efforts throughout occupied Germany. The psychological impact of the Ruhr surrender rippled far beyond the immediate military consequences. German soldiers throughout the Western theaters of operation heard about the mass capitulation and began questioning whether continued resistance served any purpose. In Munich, Stuttgart, and Frankfurt, Wehrmacht commanders faced mutinous troops who demanded to know why they should keep fighting when an entire army group had already surrendered. The propaganda value for the Allies was immense. Radio broadcasts proclaimed that Germany's finest defensive commander
had seen the futility of further resistance and dissolved his command rather than order more senseless bloodshed. Hitler, sequestered in his Berlin bunker and increasingly detached from reality, erupted in volcanic rage when news of the Ruhr collapse reached him on April 19th. He ranted for hours about traitors and cowards, demanding that Model be court-martialed and executed. When informed that Model was already dead by his own hand, Hitler's fury only intensified. He ordered that Model's family be arrested and his name stricken from all military records. The field marshal who had once been the Führer's most trusted fireman was now declared a traitor whose memory was to be erased from German history. But Hitler's ravings meant nothing to the men who had served under Model in the Ruhr. They were alive. They were prisoners, yes, confined behind barbed wire and uncertain of their futures.
But they were alive, and that was more than could be said for the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had perished on the Eastern Front or in the final apocalyptic defense of Berlin. The soldiers who surrendered in the Ruhr made a calculation that proved correct. They chose survival over a glorious death, pragmatism over fanaticism, and in doing so, they ensured that they would live to see their families again and help rebuild Germany from the ashes. The immediate aftermath of the surrender presented American forces with unprecedented challenges. Processing 325,000 prisoners required a bureaucratic machinery that had to be improvised on the fly. Intelligence officers needed to screen every prisoner to identify SS members, Gestapo agents, Nazi Party officials, and potential war criminals. This screening process was crucial because the Allies had committed to prosecuting individuals responsible for atrocities while allowing ordinary soldiers to be repatriated eventually. The task was enormous and time-consuming, requiring interrogation of prisoners, examination of documents, and cross-referencing of names against lists of wanted individuals compiled by various Allied intelligence agencies. Captain Robert Henshaw, a 32-year-old intelligence officer from Portland, Oregon, found himself assigned to one of the screening teams processing Ruhr prisoners. Henshaw had studied German history and literature at the University of Oregon before the war and spoke fluent German, making him invaluable for interrogation work. He set up operations in a requisitioned brewery in Dortmund, where a steady stream of prisoners was brought before him for questioning. Each interview followed a similar pattern. Henshaw would ask for the prisoner's name, rank, unit, and service history. He would inquire about Nazi Party membership, participation in specific operations, and knowledge of war crimes. Most prisoners answered truthfully, understanding that lies would eventually be discovered and could result in harsher treatment. What struck Henshaw most during these interviews was not defiance or fanaticism, but overwhelming relief. These German soldiers, many of them combat veterans with years of frontline experience, seemed genuinely grateful to be alive and in American custody. They spoke openly about their disillusionment with the Nazi regime, the insanity of Hitler's final orders, and their fear of falling into Soviet hands. One sergeant, a weathered man in his late 30s named Klaus Zimmermann, told Henshaw that surrendering to the Americans was the first sensible order he had received in months. Zimmermann had fought from France to Russia and back again. He had watched friends die for objectives that were abandoned within days. He had seen German cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. When Model dissolved Army Group B and released them from their oaths, Zimmermann said it felt like a prison sentence had been commuted. The screening process identified several thousand prisoners who warranted further investigation. These included members of the Waffen-SS who had served in units implicated in atrocities, Gestapo officers who had administered the Nazi police state, and Nazi Party officials who held positions of authority in occupied territories. These individuals were separated from the general prisoner population and transferred to specialized interrogation centers where they faced intensive questioning. Some would eventually stand trial for war crimes. Others would be held for years as witnesses or for intelligence purposes. But for the vast majority of the 325,000 prisoners from the Ruhr, the screening process resulted in classification as ordinary prisoners of war, who would be held until the war's end and then repatriated. The prisoner of war camps established to house the Ruhr captives varied significantly in their conditions and organization. Some were hastily erected enclosures in open fields, consisting of nothing more than barbed wire fences surrounding muddy ground where prisoners slept in tents or under makeshift shelters. Others were more substantial facilities, utilizing existing German military barracks or factory buildings that had been converted to house prisoners. The largest of these camps, established near Remagen, held over 80,000 German prisoners at its peak. The camp sprawled across several square kilometers of farmland, divided into sections by barbed wire and guard towers. Prisoners lived in tents arranged in neat rows with communal latrines and washing facilities. American guards, many of them recent arrivals from training camps in the United States who had never seen combat, patrolled the perimeter and maintained order within the camp. Life in these camps settled into a monotonous routine. Prisoners woke at dawn to roll call, where they were counted and checked against rosters to ensure no one had escaped during the night. After roll call came breakfast, typically consisting of bread, ersatz coffee, and occasionally some form of porridge or soup. The rations provided to prisoners were less generous than those given to American troops, reflecting both supply constraints and a deliberate policy of maintaining nutritional minimums rather than abundance.
Following breakfast, prisoners were organized into work details. Some were assigned to maintenance tasks within the camp itself, repairing fences, digging latrines, or improving drainage. Others were transported under guard to work on infrastructure projects in surrounding areas, clearing rubble from bombed cities, repairing roads and bridges, or helping with agricultural labor on German farms whose owners lacked able-bodied workers. The work was hard, but not brutal. American guards generally treated prisoners with professional detachment rather than personal hostility. There were exceptions, of course. Some guards harbored deep resentment toward Germans for the war, for American casualties, for the devastation visited upon Europe. Occasional incidents of mistreatment occurred, usually involving verbal abuse or denial of privileges rather than physical violence. The American military command took these incidents seriously when they were reported, both because of Geneva Convention obligations and because maintaining discipline among guards was essential for camp security and order. For the German prisoners, the most difficult aspect of captivity was not physical hardship, but psychological uncertainty. They did not know how long they would be held. They had no reliable information about the fate of their families. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored when they did arrive. Rumors circulated constantly through the camps, wild speculations about impending releases, about harsh new policies, about transfers to other camps or even to the Soviet zone. The prisoners created informal social structures within the camps to cope with the uncertainty and boredom. Former officers, stripped of their rank insignia but still commanding respect from enlisted men, organized educational programs where prisoners taught each other languages, mathematics, or technical skills. Others formed musical groups, using improvised instruments to perform concerts that provided brief respites from the tedium of camp life. One particularly remarkable aspect of the Ruhr prisoner experience was the gradual shift in how many prisoners viewed their captors. In the initial days following surrender, prisoners saw American soldiers primarily as enemies who happened to have won. But as weeks turned into months, a strange familiarity developed. Guards and prisoners engaged in tentative conversations, exchanging cigarettes for small favors, sharing photographs of families back home, even joking about the absurdities of war. Not all guards participated in these fraternization efforts, and official policy discouraged excessive friendliness between captors and captives.
But human nature resisted rigid categories of enemy and friend. Young American soldiers from Iowa or Georgia found that German prisoners were not monsters, but ordinary men who had been swept up in a catastrophic war they did not start and could not stop. This evolution in perception was mutual. German prisoners who had been indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda about American barbarism and racial inferiority discovered that their captors were neither barbarians nor inferior. The African American soldiers who guarded some sections of the camps particularly challenged German racial assumptions. These Black American troops, many of whom had faced discrimination and segregation in their own country, treated German prisoners with firm but fair professionalism. For German soldiers raised on Nazi racial ideology, the experience of being guarded by Black soldiers who demonstrated competence, discipline, and humanity was profoundly disorienting and, for some, transformative. By late May 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender finalized and the European war officially over, the status of the Ruhr prisoners began to shift from combatants to occupied subjects. The Allied powers had agreed at various wartime conferences on policies for occupied Germany, including the handling of former Wehrmacht soldiers. The general policy was that most ordinary soldiers would be released gradually after thorough screening, while those guilty of war crimes or deeply involved in Nazi organizations would face justice.
The release process was gradual and bureaucratic. Prisoners selected for release underwent final screening, received discharge papers that documented their prisoner of war status and release date, and were provided with basic civilian clothing to replace their worn Wehrmacht uniforms. They were given travel documents allowing them to return to their home regions and small amounts of occupation currency to sustain them until they could find work or rejoin family. Then they were transported to the nearest functioning train station or simply pointed toward the roads leading home and told to walk. For these men, the journey home was often as difficult as their months in captivity. Germany in the summer and fall of 1945 was a landscape of devastation. Major cities were fields of rubble, with only occasional buildings standing intact. Transportation infrastructure was crippled, with bridges destroyed and rail lines damaged or cut. Roads were clogged with refugees, displaced persons, and released prisoners, all trying to reach destinations that might no longer exist. Food was scarce, obtained through rationing systems administered by occupying forces or through black market exchanges. Many prisoners returning home discovered that their houses had been destroyed by bombing, that family members had been killed or displaced, that the communities they remembered no longer existed in any recognizable form. Yet they returned, these survivors of the Ruhr surrender, carrying with them memories of a war lost and a captivity that had saved their lives. They returned to build new lives from the ruins of the old. They married or reunited with wives they had not seen in years. They found work in the massive reconstruction efforts that would gradually transform Germany from a devastated wasteland into an economic powerhouse. They raised children who would grow up in a very different Germany, a democratic nation integrated into Western Europe rather than a militaristic empire bent on conquest. The story of why 300,000 German soldiers chose surrender over continued resistance cannot be reduced to simple cowardice or opportunism. These men made rational calculations about survival in the face of impossible odds. They recognized that Hitler's war was lost and that dying for a defeated cause served no purpose. They understood that captivity under the Americans, while uncertain and uncomfortable, offered a chance at survival and eventual return home. Most fundamentally, they grasped that the choice before them was not between honor and dishonor, but between pragmatic survival and pointless death. Field Marshal Walter Model's decision to dissolve Army Group B rather than order its surrender or its destruction represented a similar calculation, though filtered through his personal code of military honor. Model could not bring himself to formally surrender, as that would violate the oath he had sworn to Hitler and betray everything he had believed about duty and loyalty. But he also could not continue ordering men to die when defeat was certain.
His solution, releasing his soldiers from their oaths and allowing them to choose their own fates, was both an evasion and an act of mercy. It allowed Model to avoid personal dishonor while enabling his soldiers to survive. That he chose death for himself while facilitating life for his men reveals the profound psychological contradictions faced by German officers who had sworn absolute loyalty to a regime they had come to recognize as evil and doomed. The mass surrender in the Ruhr had strategic consequences beyond simply removing 325,000 German soldiers from the battlefield. It freed up American divisions that had been committed to reducing the pocket, allowing them to advance rapidly towards Leipzig and the Elbe River, where they would eventually link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. It demoralized remaining German forces in the west, many of whom saw the Ruhr collapse as proof that further resistance was futile. It provided the Allies with an enormous intelligence windfall, as interrogation of senior German officers captured in the pocket yielded detailed information about German military organization, tactics, and remaining strength. Perhaps most significantly, the Ruhr surrender demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, despite its fearsome reputation and years of fanatical resistance, was ultimately composed of human beings who preferred life to death when given a choice. The mythology of the German soldier as a superhuman warrior willing to fight to the last bullet had been powerful during the war years, sustained by Nazi propaganda and by genuine acts of stubborn resistance in desperate circumstances. But in the Ruhr, when confronted with the reality of certain defeat and offered the alternative of honorable surrender, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers chose survival. This choice did not diminish their earlier courage or military effectiveness. It simply revealed that even the most disciplined and indoctrinated soldiers will choose life when death serves no purpose. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.